Ever since the Tea Party insurrection, conservatives have had a favorite statistic. It is not the number of gun deaths in Chicago, which has relatively strict gun laws, or how much money from Medicare is used to fund Obamacare. It's this.
Independent economists have found that debt loads greater than 90% of GDP could result in the loss of up to 1 million jobs.
Once a country's debt burden reaches 90% of the economy, you have a significant downturn in economic growth.
Economists who have studied sovereign debt tell us that letting total debt rise above 90% of GDP creates a drag on economic growth and intensifies the risk of a debt-fueled economic crisis.
That sounds scary. And the reason it sounds scary is this. Look at our own debt to GDP ratio. Here we stand, America, on the precipice of disaster because science says so. His favorite conservative stat came from an impressive paper from economists Carmen Reinhart and Kenneth Rogoff. The two achieved fame for writing an incredibly exhaustively researched history of the last 8 centuries of financial crises called This Time It's Different. I've read it, and it's really quite good in many places. But the one number that policymakers have clung to was this 90% statistic. It's taken from a paper the two published in 2010, which suggests that countries with public debt more than 90% of GDP will have negative economic growth. Senator Tom Coburn, Republican from Oklahoma and member of the Senate Finance Committee, emphasized why this finding was the Rosetta Stone for understanding our economic peril. If you study Reinhart and Rogoff and what they said, they know what's coming. Every country that's ever had a debt crisis and has printed money has ended up with an inflation problem. Well, an incredible thing happened last week, and it was drowned out by lots of other news. But honestly, it's one of the most astonishing things in recent economic history. A grad student, Thomas Herndon, a 28-year-old at the University of Massachusetts Amherst, had an assignment. Rerun someone else's data and see if you can get the same results. Herndon chose the Reinhart-Rogoff study. He looks at an Excel spreadsheet. We've all seen them. And the first thing he sees is the crucial column in their data, the one that averages the growth rates of countries with debt to GDP ratios of 90%, is wrong. It's got a mistake. The average should have contained data from rows 30 to 49, but instead only averaged the data from 30 to 44. 5 missing rows, all because of a typo, apparently. And it meant that poor little Belgium, for instance, which had a pretty decent growth even with high debt level, was left out. And not only that, the authors selectively omitted a number of countries in the post-World War II era, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand, that experienced good growth with high levels of debt. So, here's the punchline. If you correct the spreadsheet error and put the intentionally omitted countries back into the data set, the entire statistic falls apart. Instead of countries with the dangerous level of 90% debt to GDP having a negative growth rate of 0.1%, they have a modestly positive growth rate of 2.2%. That is a big freaking difference. That's the difference between recession and recovery, which means the intellectual cornerstone for the arguments about austerity coming from the Republican Party was based in part upon a screw-up on an Excel spreadsheet from two of the most widely lauded economists in the world. Think about that for a moment. The bigger issue, though, is that the entire project, the one used by conservatives to throw a lasso around the world and rope in a magic number that pointed toward austerity, was intellectually bankrupt. The basic idea that the Paul Ryans and Tom Coburns of the world were pushing was that high levels of debt led to slow growth. We have slow growth now, and it's because we have debt that's too high. Of course, it's hardly the case that Republican politicians, and even Tim Geithner, reviewed the Rogoff-Reinhart paper and were persuaded to advocate for cuts. No, the reason they loved this statistic is because it was marshaled in favor of an argument that powerful people wanted to make anyway. Which is why the debunking of this statistic isn't going to stop Paul Ryan or Tom Coburn or John Cornyn or anyone else from taking to the floor to talk about all the reasons we need to cut government spending. They want to cut government spending not because they happen to read some economist paper. They want to cut government spending because that is what they want ideologically. It's what they're committed to, largely because a lot of powerful interests with a lot of money are committed to it as well. And the grinding misery it is producing is simply on some other part of the spreadsheet they haven't bothered to click on. We'll be right back, and I'm going to show you what that looks like.